The deafness is more than I want to take on right now. That was the message a founder worth $200 million sat alone reading at a restaurant table, 2 days before Christmas, moments before two little girls she had never met walked over and asked her, in the only language that had ever truly seen her, if they could sit down. To understand how she ended up alone at that table, and who those two girls really were, we need to rewind. 2 days before Christmas. In a quiet corner of Cleveland most people never think to look. Daniel Cole was 36 years old, and he believed one simple thing: if he worked hard enough and loved his daughters with everything he had, the rest of the world's opinion didn't matter. Not the way people's eyes slid past his work uniform in the grocery line. Not the landlord who once stared at his pay stub and asked, twice, if he could really afford rent on his own. He believed it quietly, the way some men believe in the weather. He had no idea that on this particular Tuesday, a woman he had never spoken to was about to be humiliated 40 feet from where he was mopping a hallway. He had no idea that within a week, his entire life built from night shifts, second-hand programming manuals, and a promise made to a woman who could no longer hear him say it would be laid bare in front of 200 cameras. Nothing here is exaggerated. Every quiet cruelty in this story happens somewhere, to someone, every single day. 045, the table on Euclid Avenue. The restaurant sat downtown on Euclid Avenue. White tablecloths. Candles that never dripped. Clara Whitfield, 38, sat across from a board member of her own company, a man with a rehearsed laugh and a watch worth more than most people's cars. She wore a plain black dress and her mother's old silver bracelet, the one thing she kept from a time when she still believed love came without conditions. Clara was deaf, and had been since birth. She ran the largest accessibility technology company on the East Coast, and had long ago learned to read a room by watching hands, not listening for voices. For an hour the conversation drifted along pleasantly enough. Then he excused himself to the restroom. Her phone buzzed against the tablecloth. The deafness is more than I want to take on right now. Take care. She read it twice. Her face didn't move. Around her, forks clinked, couples laughed, the restaurant hummed with a warmth that suddenly had nothing to do with her. Her hand trembled slightly as she signed for the check. The waiter's expression shifted from polite to pitying, and somehow the pity was worse than the message itself. That's when two small girls appeared at her table. Can we sit with you? 6-year-old twins, sandy hair, eyes carrying the kind of seriousness only children have when they've decided something matters. One of them lifted both hands and signed slowly, carefully, like someone who had practiced the whole car ride over. Can we sit with you? You look very sad. Clara went still. It had been years since a stranger used her own language first, unprompted, in a room built for people who could hear. A man came half-jogging across the dining room, face flushed, reaching for both girls' hands. Tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from physical labor, not gyms. His jacket carried a maintenance company's logo, fabric worn thin at the elbows. He crouched to sign an apology to his daughters, and Clara caught his hands, not romantically, just noticing something that didn't add up. His palms were scarred with small, round burns, clustered too precisely to be from a mop bucket. From a soldering iron. Hundreds of times, on skin that kept coming back for more. Daniel Cole, he said, low and short, not quite meeting her eyes. Night maintenance. Your building, actually. The girls wouldn't budge, small fists closed around her sleeve, hands still moving. Daddy said Christmas is for not being alone. In the weakest moment she'd had in years, Clara nodded. Let them stay. Daniel sat stiff-backed, mostly silent through the meal, reaching over only to correct his daughter's signing when their hands moved too fast to follow. Clara watched him do it, watched the way he looked at his girls, fierce and afraid at once, like a man who had already lost one person he loved and wasn't sure how many more the world would let him keep. When the girls ran off to wash their hands, Clara signed a question straight at him. Why are you so fluent? He answered in 4 signs, had to be. That's all. Then he called for the check before she could ask anything else, eyes anywhere but her face. Snow had started outside, thin and dry, the kind that never sticks. Clara watched Daniel walk his daughters out through the glass doors, one small hand in each of his, and something in her that had gone quiet a long time ago sat up and paid attention. A man in a thrift store jacket, with a dead man's calluses on a living man's hands, had just walked out of her life without asking for anything. She didn't know it yet, but the truth behind Daniel Cole's silence was about to save her company and unravel it in the very same week. Emotion and abasement. The next morning, before Clara had even set down her coffee, an email arrived from the board. Subject line: Temporary suspension of executive authority, proposed motion. The stated reasoning: communication barriers that may affect critical strategic decisions. The signature belonged to Gordon Pierce, the same man who, less than 12 hours earlier, had texted her that her deafness was more than he was willing to take on. She read it 3 times before she let herself feel anything. Then she rode the elevator down to the basement. 2 hours earlier, Daniel's morning had looked nothing like a man about to lose everything. Cereal spilled across the counter because Lily insisted on pouring it herself. Grilled cheese flipped in 4 minutes flat. The girls piling into his 15-year-old minivan for the ride to Cleveland Heights Elementary. Ordinary. Small. His. He had no idea any of it was about to become evidence in a boardroom fight he didn't know was happening. The mechanical level of Horizon Access Solutions headquarters smelled like machine oil and cold concrete. Daniel lay on his back beneath the building's aging HVAC unit, forearms streaked with grease, headlamp throwing a small circle of light against the ductwork. He didn't hear Clara approach, the compressor drowned everything out, but his daughters did. Nora and Lily came running, arms wrapping around Clara's legs like she was someone they'd known for years instead of one strange, kind dinner. Daniel's face went rigid. He slid out fast, wiped his hands on a rag that only smeared the grease around, and told his daughters, sharp, urgent, to get in the truck and wait. Before he could speak, an old security guard shuffled past with a mop cart, moving slow enough that it looked accidental. He pressed something small and plastic into Clara's palm without breaking stride, murmuring just loud enough for her to read his lips. "Mr. Cole isn't just fixing pipes, ma'am. Server room's been logging his access, pushing code into the accessibility system, 14 months running. Thought you ought to know before somebody else decides what to do about it." His badge read Walter Higgins. 31 years with the company. What the drive held. Clara locked her office door before she opened the USB drive. What loaded onto her screen made her sit down slowly. Patch after patch. The exact fixes that had kept the screen reader software from collapsing 8 months earlier, the update that had won them a federal contract that spring. 3 security vulnerabilities closed before engineering had even flagged them, all timestamped between 11 at night and 5 in the morning. All traced to a maintenance account that technically had no server access at all. She found Daniel in the old server room an hour later. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised that she knew. "My wife was deaf," he said, not looking up from the cable he was coiling. "Completely. She got sick 5 years ago, the kind that doesn't leave. We had almost 4 good years after the diagnosis. She passed a little over a year ago. I taught myself to sign so I could talk to her. Then I taught myself to code, because the software this company built back then barely worked, and she needed it to work if she wanted to keep her job." He set the cable down. "After she passed, I kept writing the patches every night. It was the only way I still knew how to talk to her." What drove him wasn't really the code. It was refusing to let a hospital room be the last conversation he ever had with her. He feared becoming ordinary in his daughter's eyes, a man they'd learned to excuse instead of admire, and wanted, more than credit or safety, to still be useful to someone who no longer needed him. He told Clara now, and defended nothing, because she already held the evidence. There was no version of tonight where hiding still worked. Then, almost as an afterthought, she used to work in this building. Accessibility department, 5 years back. Got let go for not fitting the company culture. Clara went very still. Who approved that termination? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. She already knew. The same signature, twice. She spent that night at her kitchen table with a growing sense that the floor beneath her had been rotten longer than she'd realized. The unauthorized access report against Daniel, the one flagged straight to legal, had been filed the same night Gordon sent her that text. Same approver on both documents. Same cruelty, dressed up two different ways. Gordon wasn't just trying to remove her. He was 4 days from a hostile takeover vote and needed 2 pieces of evidence to make it stick: a failed accessibility division, and a maintenance worker who'd broken into company servers. He'd engineered both, and planned to sell off the entire disability technology division, the one thing at this company that had ever meant anything to Clara, to a competitor with no interest in keeping it alive. Daniel was fired before lunch the next day. He lost his staff housing within the hour, and with the complaint already sitting on a detective's desk and a police interview scheduled that afternoon, there was no adult left named who could watch the girls while he answered for it. By evening, a caseworker stood in his driveway, explaining that his daughters would be placed in temporary care while the situation was assessed. Clara found him in the parking garage stairwell, alone, elbows on his knees, staring at a phone screen gone dark in his hand. He still had the maintenance jacket on. "Don't fight this for me," he said before she could set her bag down. His voice had gone rough, not angry, just worn thin. "Save your seat. I don't want my girls to be the reason you lose everything you built. They took your daughters, Daniel. I know what they took." He stood and looked at her straight on. "I've already lost a wife to something I couldn't fix by working harder. I am not going to lose my company's president too, because she felt sorry for the maintenance guy." He walked past her toward the stairwell door. She stood a long moment holding the termination report, staring at the signature at the bottom, the same man who once called her deafness more than he was looking for, now deciding on paper whether 2 little girls kept their father. The boardroom. Clara went back to the boardroom the next morning with the only weapon she had left, the truth, and the willingness to say it in front of cameras. She stood at the head of the long glass table, hands steady, and signed while her interpreter spoke aloud. "If this vote proceeds, I will hold a press conference within 24 hours. I will tell every reporter in this city exactly how this board used my deafness as justification to remove me. And exactly how you manufactured a break-in charge against a man who single-handedly saved this company's accessibility division, for free, for over a year." Gordon's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Around the table, other board members suddenly found their folders very interesting. Gordon smiled the way he always did, thin, patient. "You understand, of course, that a press conference like that could be read as further evidence of instability." "I understand that you'd like it to be read that way," Clara signed back. "That's the difference between us. You need people to believe a story. I only need them to see the truth." The vote was postponed, 7-4, with 2 abstentions. Gordon didn't argue the count. He simply gathered his folder and left first, something Clara would realize later should have told her everything. Men like Gordon didn't walk away from a fight unless they already had the next one loaded. The video. For about 6 hours, it felt like a win. Word moved through the company fast. Someone taped a sign to the elevator: "We see you, Ms. Whitfield." Clara let herself feel, for the first time in days, something close to relief. She should have known better. Police came for Daniel less than an hour after he walked away from her in that stairwell. The complaint had already been sitting on a detective's desk, and Gordon made sure it moved fast. Daniel spent that night in a holding cell, formally charged now, not just accused. The postponed board vote hadn't touched the criminal complaint at all. Nora and Lily spent the night in a county placement home, sharing a twin bed neither of them was used to. 2 streets over, Daniel's elderly neighbor, Ms. Alma, sat on her porch swing, the one he'd rebuilt for her, free, 2 summers back, and said to no one in particular, "That man has never once asked this neighborhood for anything." She didn't know yet how to help. She just knew something had gone very wrong. At 11:42 that night, a message arrived on Clara's phone. 18 seconds long, sent from a caseworker's tablet, a small act of quiet rebellion by someone who understood exactly what these 2 girls needed to say, and to whom. Lily's face filled the screen, chin trembling, hands moving in short, careful bursts. "Daddy's hands are sad. The bad man said he will break them forever. Please don't let him." Clara watched it 4 times. She did not cry. She had trained herself a long time ago not to, because crying in front of hearing people so often turned into evidence that she was too emotional to be trusted with anything important. Gordon moved first. By 7 the next morning, the rejection text, "The deafness is more than I want to take on right now," was already circulating, screenshotted and stripped of context, paired with restaurant security footage someone on his payroll had quietly obtained. Clara alone at that white tablecloth table, wiping her face with a napkin before the twins had ever appeared. Someone captioned it, "Unstable founder exploits her own disability for sympathy." The hashtag caught within the hour. By 9, 3 morning shows were discussing it, none of them reaching out to Clara first. By noon, the company's stock had dropped 11%, and the board called an emergency session without her. They didn't wait for her rebuttal. They didn't ask for one. The statement went out at 4:15. Clara Whitfield was suspended from her role as founder and CEO, effective immediately, in the interest of restoring public and shareholder confidence. The accessibility division, the one Daniel had kept alive with 14 months of unpaid overnight work, was formally shuttered that same day. The district attorney's office quietly upgraded Daniel's complaint from misdemeanor to felony unauthorized computer access that same afternoon. The girls were moved into a longer foster arrangement while the situation with their father was resolved. A caseworker explained, in the flat tone of someone who has said this sentence too many times, that visitation could be suspended for months. Clara sat alone in her apartment that night with the lights off. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She sat down on the cold bathroom tile, knees pulled to her chest, and let herself feel the full weight of everything the last 3 days had taken from her. Her company. Her reputation. The one project that had ever made her disability feel like a gift instead of a deficiency. And the only man who had ever looked at her hands moving through the air and called it a language instead of a limitation. She raised her hands into the empty room and signed slowly, to no one, "I'm sorry." She didn't know who she meant it for anymore. What she had wanted was never sympathy. It was to stop having to prove, over and over, that her deafness wasn't a flaw in her judgment. Underneath the composure sat an older fear that the one time she let people see her hurting, they'd use it as proof she'd been unfit all along. So instead of raging, she apologized to an empty room, quietly, the way she'd been trained to since she was a girl. Outside, the city kept moving, headlights sliding across the ceiling, a siren somewhere far off. Clara thought about her mother's bracelet, still on her wrist, and what her mother used to sign to her whenever the world got too loud. You don't have to be understood to be worthy of love. You only have to be true. She wasn't sure she believed it that night. But she held on to the shape of it anyway. Somewhere across town, Daniel lay awake on a thin county mattress, wondering if his daughters would remember, years from now, that their father had once tried, or if all they'd carry forward was the night the system decided he wasn't enough. Neither of them knew yet that 2 small girls with a notebook full of their mother's handwriting were about to walk into a press conference and change everything. The press conference was scheduled for 10 the next morning, in the largest hall Horizon Access Solutions owned, the same glass-walled room where the company usually announced product launches, now packed with more than 200 reporters and cameras. Gordon Pierce stood at the podium in a charcoal suit, voice smooth, rehearsed, dressed up in the language of concern. He talked about necessary stability, about responsibility to shareholders. When he reached the part about Clara, he looked into the nearest camera and lowered his voice half a register, as if what he said next pained him personally. "We simply need leadership our stakeholders can trust without complication," he said. Given the communication difficulties involved in crisis leadership, the board feels. He never finished the sentence. Clara sat in the front row, spine straight, hands folded, refusing to give him anything to photograph. She had rehearsed this moment overnight, the walk, the silence, the dignity she'd refused to surrender. She had not rehearsed for what happened next. The doors at the back of the hall opened. Nora and Lily Cole walked in side by side, a caseworker a respectful few steps behind. Plain clothes from the placement home, nothing staged. But their eyes were sharp, entirely certain of what they'd come to do. The room went silent the way 200 adults go silent around 2 children who don't belong on a stage built for scandal. Clara went white and rose halfway out of her chair before catching herself, one hand pressed flat against her chest. She recognized the notebook before she recognized anything else. She'd seen its twin on Daniel's workbench days earlier. Whatever these girls carried, they hadn't been coached to bring it. The girls didn't cry. Didn't hesitate. They walked straight up onto the stage, stopped in front of Gordon Pierce, turned to face the room, and began to sign, slowly, clearly, the exact way their father had taught them. Nora raised a worn spiral-bound notebook above her head, open toward the cameras. Every page was covered in handwriting, two hands layered over years, neat, cramped engineering notes in blue ink, and beneath them, in looping cursive written first, one line underlined twice. If one day I'm not here, let these hands keep building bridges for those who can't hear. Lily signed the rest, and a young interpreter near the stage, a Horizon employee who'd learned ASL and never expected to use it like this, began translating aloud, her voice shaking only slightly. Our daddy never broke into anything. He just fixed the holes the bad man left on purpose, so the project would fail, so he could sell it. Our daddy fixed it every night for free because he loved our mommy, and he loves us, and this company was the last place that ever meant something to her. The live stream crossed 1 million views in 18 minutes. The hashtag that had buried Clara 2 days earlier began reversing in real time. Then came the moment nobody in that room saw coming. A young man stood up from the middle rows, Marcus Pierce, 28, Gordon's own son, seated close enough to the aisle that a dozen cameras swung toward him before he'd opened his mouth. His voice cracked on the first word and steadied by the third. My father hid something from me my whole life. He turned toward the cameras, hands trembling slightly. My little sister is deaf. He sent her away to a private program when she was young so no one at his firm would ever have to know. I only found out 2 years ago, by accident. He told me never to mention it again. He drew a breath. He has spent 5 years trying to bury this project. He gestured toward the darkened accessibility display behind the stage. Because he can't stand to look at anything that reminds him he couldn't accept his own daughter. Gordon didn't move. For the first time, he had nothing rehearsed to say. The hall broke open. Chairs scraping back, questions shouted over each other, a reporter already dictating a headline before the sentence had finished ringing through the room. Security moved in around Gordon, not to protect him, but to get him off the stage before the situation became something the lawyers couldn't manage. Marcus's real fight had never been with his father on that stage. It was with the version of himself that had stayed quiet for years to keep the peace at home. He was terrified of becoming a smaller copy of the man raising him, complicit by silence, the same way his father had been complicit by design. What he wanted was simple and overdue, for his sister to exist out loud, in front of people who couldn't pretend not to have heard it. He chose a stage instead of a phone call, because a phone call was exactly the kind of quiet, private room his father had always known how to control. This, finally, was not. Within hours, the entire takeover plan fell apart. Board members who had voted with Gordon 2 days earlier began issuing statements distancing themselves as fast as their legal teams could draft them. The district attorney's office, facing public scrutiny and contradicting server logs, quietly moved to drop the charges against Daniel before the evening news cycle even started. By 9 that night, Clara Whitfield was reinstated as CEO, with full veto authority over any future personnel or project decision touching the accessibility division. Nobody argued the terms. Somewhere in a downtown holding facility, a guard unlocked a cell door and told Daniel he was free to go. He just sat on the thin bench, hands loose in his lap, staring at the guard like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Mr. Cole. The guard said it again, slower. You're free. Charges dropped about an hour ago, straight from the DA's office. Your daughters are still with the county for tonight. That's a family court matter, separate from this one, and it won't move this fast. But this part's real. You can walk out that door right now. Daniel stood on legs that didn't quite feel like his own. Nobody had explained anything yet. Not the press conference, not the notebook, not what his daughters had done on a stage in front of 200 cameras while he sat in a cell 3 miles away, believing he'd already lost them. He walked out into a light Cleveland rain, not knowing any of it. What Daniel didn't know yet was that Clara was waiting for him just outside those doors, with a blank contract and the one kind of offer he'd never once in his life been given. She was exactly where she said she'd be, put up against the rain, a folder tucked under one arm to keep it dry. She'd been standing there long enough that her shoes had gone dark at the toes, but she hadn't let herself sit down, hadn't let herself do anything but wait. Daniel stopped a few feet from her, still blinking against the outside light after a night under fluorescence. Neither of them said anything for a moment. There wasn't a sign yet for what either of them was feeling. Not one either of them had learned. She didn't offer him a job. She didn't offer him a thank you gift, or a title, or any of the things people offer when what they really mean is I feel guilty and I want this to be over. She held out the folder instead. Inside was a single blank contract. You write the terms, she signed. I'll just sign. Daniel looked at the blank page for a long moment, like a man who'd been handed something he didn't trust, because nobody had ever handed him anything without a catch attached. Then he found a bench under the overhang, sat down, and picked up the pen. He wrote, slowly, in the same handwriting the whole world had seen on that notebook the day before, head of the newly restored Accessibility Technology Division. Final authority on product decisions. No more overrides from a board that didn't understand the people the software was built for. A permanent policy, in writing, that no deaf employee could ever again be dismissed for not fitting company culture. And the project itself renamed, not after him, not after Clara, but after the woman who had started it all 5 years before either of them fully understood what it would cost, and what it would eventually give back. Clara read every line. She signed without hesitating on a single word. The company changed fast after that, the way institutions sometimes do once the right kind of pressure finally lands in the right place. Gordon Pierce was formally investigated by the board's outside counsel within the week. Most of his allies resigned before they could be asked to. He lost every seat he'd held in the company, and not long after, faced a civil suit filed by his own son on behalf of his sister. A suit Marcus pursued not for money, people close to the family said, but simply so there would be a public record that what his father did had actually mattered, had actually harmed someone, and hadn't just quietly disappeared into a boardroom's private business. The Accessibility Division relaunched under its new name that spring, with Daniel Cole's picture on the internal announcement. Not smiling too widely, exactly the way he looked in most photographs, but standing straight in a clean company badge instead of a maintenance uniform, next to a small plaque bearing his late wife's name. Walter Higgins, the security guard who'd slipped Clara that first USB drive, was there for the unveiling too, standing near the back of the room in his same worn uniform, looking for once like a man who'd been thanked properly for something he'd never expected credit for. 3 days later, once a family court judge reviewed the dropped criminal complaint, the DA's formal withdrawal, and a stack of character statements from neighbors and co-workers, full custody was returned following an expedited emergency hearing. Nora and Lily came home to their father on a gray, rainy afternoon that felt to all three of them like the first real breath any of them had taken in weeks. Before they even reached Daniel's front door, they ran to Clara first, small arms wrapping around her waist, quick and fierce, and only then turned to their father, who dropped to one knee on the porch, something unreadable and enormous moving across his face. Lily pulled back first, hands already moving. We told everyone the truth, Daddy. We used our hands like you taught us. Daniel laughed, a short, wet, disbelieving sound, half a sob dressed up as something lighter. And signed back the only thing he could manage. I know, baby. I know. I saw. He hadn't seen it, not really, only heard the story from Clara over the last 3 days, replayed until he knew every beat of it by heart. It didn't matter. He meant it the way a father means most things he says to his children, true in every way that counted, even if the facts arrived a little out of order. Clara and Daniel looked at each other for one long second over the girls' heads. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. That night, a message arrived on Clara's phone, not a text this time, but a video. Translated from sign into careful, deliberate captions layered over Daniel's own hands moving in his kitchen light. Thank you, the message read, for not seeing me as a charity case. Clara read it twice, the way she'd once read a very different message on a very different night, at a table she'd give almost anything to forget. She noticed her own hand wasn't shaking this time. This one she saved, and didn't delete, and found herself watching again before she fell asleep. Somewhere between a blank contract and a video message sent at midnight, something neither of them had planned for had quietly started to take root. 3 months passed. No wedding. No grand proposal. No flashing cameras. Just quiet evenings repeated in the same small Tremont duplex, where cereal still occasionally ended up on the counter and the old minivan still coughed twice before catching in the cold. Clara started coming by most Thursdays, after the girls' bedtime routine wound down but before it felt improper to anyone who might be watching, not that either of them cared much anymore what people watching might think. She sat on Daniel's worn living room couch, sleeves pushed up, learning how to hold a soldering iron steady in hands that had spent 20 years signing board presentations instead of fixing circuit boards. The first few attempts went badly enough that Daniel kept a small fire extinguisher within reach, only half joking about it, and the girls had taken to narrating her progress like sports commentators, signing dramatic play-by-plays from the kitchen doorway whenever she managed a clean connection. "You're gripping it like it owes you money," Daniel told her one night, guiding her wrist with 2 scarred fingers, gentle in a way his hands didn't look like they should be capable of. "Loosen up. It's not going anywhere." She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her before she could catch it, and the solder finally sat clean. Most nights the girls wedged themselves between the two adults on the couch, signing rapid-fire stories about their new teacher, who had started learning basic ASL herself after Nora mentioned, very matter-of-factly, that Miss Clara basically taught our whole school. Neither Daniel nor Clara corrected them. It wasn't far from true. Some Sundays, Miss Alma from 2 doors down still came by with a plate of something warm from her oven, settling into the porch swing Daniel had rebuilt for her, the one that still creaked exactly the same on the 3rd push. She'd watch Clara help the girls with their homework through the front window and shake her head slowly, smiling to herself. "Told you something would turn out right for that man," she'd say to nobody, the way old women on porches have said true things to nobody for as long as there have been porches. Daniel never told her she was wrong. One particular Thursday, snow falling steady and quiet outside the window, the same kind of snow that had been falling the night 2 little girls first walked up to a stranger's table, Daniel set a mug of tea down in front of Clara and sat across from her, hands moving slow and deliberate, choosing each sign the way a man chooses words he's been holding on to for a while. "I don't need saving," he signed. "I just need to be seen as I am." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she raised her own hands and answered simply, "Me too." For hands, too large and scarred, too small and still learning, came together under the warm kitchen light and signed the same word, one after another, like a chain. On the bookshelf Daniel had built with his own hands the summer before his wife passed, her old notebook sat in a place of honor now, its cover soft with age, right beside a new photograph of the 4 of them, taken the week before at a little diner near Lakeside Avenue. Nobody in the photo was smiling too widely. They were simply looking straight into the camera, steady. The particular kind of calm that only belongs to people who have walked through a storm together and chosen, afterward, to stay. Nora had picked the photo spot on the shelf herself, right beside her mother's notebook, and explained her reasoning with the total seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage, "So Mommy can see we're okay now." Daniel hadn't trusted his voice enough to answer that one out loud. He just signed yes, over and over, until Nora seemed satisfied he understood. That night, once the girls were finally asleep and Daniel had walked her to the door the way he always did, Clara went home, turned off her lights, closed the window against the cold, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, fell asleep without keeping one hand near her phone, waiting for a rejectee. What this story leaves us. This story reminds us that the people the world is quickest to overlook are so often the ones carrying the most weight quietly, without ever asking anyone to notice. A man in a thrift store jacket can be building something in the dark that saves an entire company. A woman who can't hear a single spoken word in a crowded room can still hear, better than most of us ever will, exactly who is telling her the truth and who is only performing kindness. If there's someone in your family working nights nobody sees, raising kids alone with no one clapping for him, don't wait for him to ask for help. Men like that rarely do. Call him this week and say something specific. "I'm bringing dinner Thursday, don't argue with me." A vague "let me know if you need anything" is easy for a proud man to decline. A meal left on the porch step isn't. If someone in your life speaks a little differently, hears a little differently, or just needs a beat longer to answer, face them when you talk instead of calling out from the next room. Let them finish their own sentence before you finish it for them. That's not a kindness you're doing them. It's simply the attention most people stopped offering them a long time ago. And if you're the one who has spent years being overlooked by a family, a workplace, or just by time itself, you don't need anyone's permission to matter. This week, write down one thing you did well that nobody thanked you for. Tape it inside a kitchen cabinet, somewhere you'll see it with your morning coffee. Let it be true simply because you know it's true. Respect doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes it's just a blank page, hand it over, and the quiet trust that whoever's holding the pen already knows exactly who they are.